Thank you for coming, and I hope you'll enjoy this afternoon's presentation. It's kind of strange how things work out. Life travels in circles. Most of you know that I moved here from Kearney a couple of years ago. And just before we were getting ready to move, my book club was reviewing a list of books that we were going to read that year. And every year there's a committee here in Nebraska that chooses a book that they want everybody in Nebraska to read, people who like to read. One book, one Nebraska. And 2 years ago, the book that was chosen was this one. And it's called My Omaha Obsession, and it was written by an author called Miss Cassette. I don't know a lot about her. She doesn't tell us much about her. But she's evidently has lived and grown up in Omaha. And her desire was to share Omaha homes with the public so that we would know something about what started Omaha, how Omaha developed. And she didn't choose homes or buildings like the Jocelyn Castle. She chose more ordinary buildings, the general nuts and bolts that made Omaha what it is. And right after we moved in here, my grandson Kyle came one day and said, I have a book I want you to read. And he brought me this book, My Omaha Obsession. And I thought, that's the book that my Kearney Club was going to read. And why did we decide not to do it? We sort of felt that we wanted to know about western Nebraska, and why would we want to know about homes in Omaha? Somehow, those of us who live out in the Midwest feel like Omaha and Lincoln kind of neglects us. And I guess that discouraged us a little from reading an Omaha book. But I'm so glad that I got to read this one. The very first chapter in the book is about a home at 4025 Izard Street. Now, Izard Street itself is something of a enigma. Where did the name Izard come from in the first place? But Izard, Mr. Izard, was the second territorial governor in the state of in Nebraska Territory, long before Nebraska became a state. And that's very short street, Izard, was named for him. There's a preview done in the book, a little forward, and I want to quote from it. This gentleman wrote a few things about Miss Cassette, the woman who wrote the book. She brings to life the broken pediments, the busted sidewalks, and the beautiful homes of Omaha. She connects historical photos, interior images, and newspaper articles, obituaries, and before long, you find yourself falling in love with the house. And that's what Miss Cassette did. She fell in love with this house at 4025 Izard. It's a Victorian, and she said she'd have to admit that as a very young girl, she and some of her friends had climbed the fence and had walked up the sides of the steps that led to a castle in the backyard. Now, it was that castle that intrigued Miss Cassette, and it's the castle that intrigued me. Where did a castle come from in the backyard of a home in Omaha? And when does one fall in love with a house? When does it become your own personal mansion, your own castle? Well, the decision was made to sell this house recently. And it took a long time to make that decision. It's hard to part with a home. Many of you have just parted with homes. And this one was especially difficult because of its beauty. But the decision was made to proceed with the sale of this house and some pretty amazing contents. And Kyle shared this information with me about this beautiful home at 4025 Izzard. It had been owned by Doug and Nancy Taylor, who had purchased this home in 1979. They loved to travel, and they had filled that house with beautiful furniture and appliances and artifacts that were especially meaningful to a home of that quality. It was after deciding to sell them, some of those pieces of equipment, those furnishings, were probably something that wouldn't be purchased by Omahans or people in the Midwest, and they were sent back east and sold back there, and the rest was put up for auction here in Omaha. Well, much work goes into preparing a home for sale, and I don't have to tell most of you that. Most of you have gone through that experience in very recent years. But in so doing, you become very well acquainted with every nook and cranny of every room, and questions arise. Even if you've lived there many, many years, when you get ready to move out for that last time, perhaps you see things you really didn't see before. Who built the house in the first place? Where did that castle in the backyard come from? And why did they put it there? And what about the mystery of the third floor? And there was a lab in the basement. This house had history. Well, if I return to Miss Cassette's book, I'll share a brief history of how this mansion came to be and how this castle at 4025 Izzard developed. At one time, this particular area of Omaha was considered a majestic part of town. The prominent people lived there, the businessmen, the lawyers, the bankers, the people who were making Omaha the city that it was to become. This mansion was built by a J.B. Mason in 1890. Now that's a long time ago. He was a local architect and a draftsman, and so he had access to some of the most beautiful and pieces of equipment that you could use. Ordinarily, people wouldn't just go to the lumber yard and buy what he used to make this building. It's told that he used over 20 different kinds of wood as he built this mansion. There were 6 bedrooms. That was quite a bit at that time. And that didn't include the third floor. 2.5 baths. In 1890, to have a bathroom was something of a privilege. There might be 3,500 square feet, and some said as many as 45. He lived there for a number of years, and the next owner was a J.A. Swanson, who lived there from 1907 until 1921. He established King Swanson Company, a men's clothing that he later became the Nebraska Clothing Company here in Omaha. The first owner did not build the castle, and the second owner did not build the castle. It was a mystery for Miss Cassette, and she was out to solve that problem, that mystery. Who built the castle in the backyard? The third owner, from 1923 to 1924, was a Mr. Milneck, a chemical engineer who worked for Union Pacific. He didn't build the castle either. Where did the castle come from? She discovered a Mr. A.E. Fletcher, a physician, bought the home, and in 1929, the property was listed as A.E. Fletcher Physician at Park Hospital. 10 years later, there was a listing as follows. Asa Fletcher, Park Hospital, Flow Chemical Company, Urego Chemical Company. And further searching shows in his quarterly that he featured treatments such as plant protein therapy and metaphysical passion mania. He was something of a health nut. It was obvious he had an obsession with plants and with chemistry. More researching on the part of Miss Cassette. Dr. Fletcher had applied for a number of patents, and among them was a skin preparation for special purposes. We're not told what those purposes were. But it was a naturalistic cure you could buy through the mail, and in 1935 an ad boasted a D-Flow product, and the advertisement said it lasts forever. We really don't know what it was. And then from the Omaha World Herald came an article in 1928. He has a castle in his backyard. At last she had solved the mystery of where did the castle came from. Briefly, he had built it for himself, his wife, and his daughter, and they enjoyed having Wiener roasts and marshmallow roasts, and we don't know what all. We do know that there was an article in the Omaha World Herald stating that the daughter belonged to the Bethel 13 Order of Job's Daughters, and that some of their festivals were held in the backyard at 4025 Izzard. As for the hospital, Fletcher was running ads in the newspaper saying that it was for those who do not care to be operated on, sort of a naturalistic cure, or for people who have been operated on and aren't happy with the results. Sometimes times just don't change. In 1938, he was running ads that described the Park Hospital as an invalid and convalescent hospital. Quiet, restful rooms, home-like, specially trained physicians and nurses, and low rates for those who wanted to make their home there. Well, who worked at Park Hospital? He had an ad in the paper for people to come as employees, and one of them stated, "I want a young lady to learn to be a nurse aide." He didn't require too much help beforehand. No tuition. We furnish room, laundry, books, and lab equipment, and give a liberal salary while learning. Sound like the ideal job for somebody who wasn't prepared for anything. And apply in person. Well, the Omaha World Herald also reported, and this is where she got most of her information about the Fletchers, and said in the 40s and 50s they did extensive traveling. And they did a lot of strange collections. They did hunting, and presumably they brought back some of those rocks that they used to make that castle, though I don't think, from my observation living here the last couple of years, those stones and rocks that he used to build that castle seem to be pretty common around here. Miss Cassette was of the opinion, after researching the Fletchers, that the Omaha natives as a whole thought the Fletchers were a little bit weird. But we know that they turned their castle and this Victorian house into a healing spiritual garden spot. Well, what becomes of a house of that nature? And when does a house become a castle? What makes a house special? In 1950, and that seems like just a day or so ago, it's actually been 3/4 of a century or more, I was married and moved to Buffalo County, Nebraska, and we were living on a dryland farm. And before the year was out, Russ and I were given the opportunity to move to an irrigated farm. It was newly developed. There had been no buildings on it before, and we called it our castle. It wasn't much. If you've driven down the highway, interstate, and even today, you can see a truck with half a house on it. And then farther down the road a little bit, you'll see the other half of that house. And you know that it isn't going to be but within just a few days, and someone's going to be living in that structure. Well, our little house didn't come on 2 trucks, it came on 1. And the person that was buying this had hoped that he could move his wife out there. And he was one of those people who lived in town and farmed, went out to the farm during the day. So he put up this big machine shed and then this little bitty house. And when he brought his wife out to live there, she said, "I can't live there. The house is too small. There are no trees. There's no lawn." But Russ and I called it our castle. And the reason we called it a castle was because we had electricity. Now, it doesn't seem possible that in this day and age that there are people living that have lived without electricity. But at that time, it had not reached very far north of Kearney, Nebraska, even though Kearney was a college town and up and coming. 10 miles north of Kearney, there was no electricity. But we could plug in a lamp. No more kerosene lamps. And as I thought back, one of the first things we bought was a toaster. And that toaster had 2 little doors, one on either side, and you laid the slice of bread on there, closed it up, and we burned a lot of bread. But we had a toaster. And I had about the second thing was an iron. I ironed everything in those days. How long has it been? How long has it been since you've plugged in your iron? But we ironed everything then, and I had an electric iron, and I also had an electric washing machine. Well, that was our castle for 20 years. We raised our children in that little place, and then we tore it down and burned it in a barrel. We'd had 2 major hailstorms that had just practically destroyed the place, and raised 3 kids, and we decided it was time to build a new house. I will not forget, though, those first 20 years in that castle in Buffalo County. Well, there's brick and wood and cement and masonite and stones. When did these elements become a castle? In 1883, Charles and Jade Stewart and their 4 youngest children immigrated from England. Now, England is the country of castles. And they were hoping to find a new life in the prairies of Greeley County, Nebraska. Their first home in America was constructed of what was often called prairie marble. And what was prairie marble? It was sod that was cut from the top of the grassy hillsides, cut into building blocks, stacked together over a hole in the ground, and you had a castle. The first two homes that you see in these pictures might have been like the ones that those people lived in. This one I know because that's my great-grandmother in front of her castle in Wheeler County, Nebraska. This was my great-grandmother on the end, and that's my dad by the horse. Actually, that picture, the only reason we have it is because they were proud of that horse. That was my great-grandmother's black stallion that was very well known in that community at that time. My dad lived there until 1915 when my great-grandmother passed away, and that was the end of his life in a sod house. But he was born in one of those early sod, a big family. There were 8 children born while they were still living in that first little sod house. And Dad often told us stories of his life and what it was like to live in that type of a castle. I don't ever remember Dad complaining. And there must have been dirt, cold, vermin, bugs, but he didn't talk about those things. He talked about the fun when all the kids came home. He talked about the geraniums that bloomed in those deep window wells, the yellow canaries that hung in the cages in front of the windows. And he often would say it was always cool in the summer and warm in the winter. And when my mother complained about rain that had come through the leaky roof in our house, he would say, well, we can always go out and put up a soddy. And her comments were, you'll have to go alone or get a new cook because I'm not going with you. But that was their castle. Another interesting experience that Kyle has had in recent months, and he has shared with me. Many of us today can share that story of deciding what to do with our home when we're through with it. And this situation arose in the little community of Elkhorn, Nebraska. Now, coming from Buffalo County to Omaha, all of these little towns, Gretna, Papillion, Chalco, Elkhorn, they all were at one time individual locations. Now, to me, it's all Omaha. But I've discovered that people who grew up in those communities have a fierce determination to retain some independence and some association with their community. When an aging historical building in the community of Elkhorn came up for sale in recent months, Kyle shared some of this history with me. I was delighted when he escorted me to a small museum in downtown Old Elkhorn, where I was given the opportunity to interview Patsy Peterson Schmidt, a resident of the area who delights in sharing her knowledge of the history of this charming part of early Nebraska. She'll sit and talk for hours about the community of Elkhorn, and she shares her knowledge with school children. She collects artifacts, and she's building a small museum there. I've only been in the community 2 or 3 times, but I found it to be a charming place, and I'm hoping this summer, when things warm up a little bit, that I could go back and spend some more time in some of those delightful little shops that are showing up in this community of Elkhorn. Well, in 1865, that's over 150 years ago, Nebraska was not a state. Some 30 years before that Victorian home on Izzard Street was built, George and Josephine Crawford preempted on 40 acres of land in what is now Elkhorn. And they built a structure. I say a structure, it was a home. They lived there as a home, but it took on many other identities. It was a store, it was a greenery, and at one time, after the schoolhouse down by the railroad tracks burned, it served as a schoolhouse for 2 different winters. Well, when George and Josephine Crawford first came there and put up that first structure, his words were, "I will build a town." And that's what he did. George and Josephine Crawford are credited with building the town of Elkhorn. Their home underwent many changes over the years. And probably one of the most monumental was when it was used as a schoolhouse for those 2 winters. It became known as the Grove Hotel when another addition was built, and it became a 1.5-story structure. It was named because of a grove of trees that grew on the west side of the building. In 1913, Carl and Ida Hess were living in the building, and it was called the Lincoln Hotel because to honor the Lincoln Highway that was just entering Elkhorn. This building was built when Abraham Lincoln was president, and it's still there today, and now it's up for sale. Well, a bit of history about Carl Hess, who lived there after the Crawfords. He and his father were emigrating to this part of the country from Germany, and his father died at sea and was buried there. And Carl, as a very young man, tried his best and succeeded in coming to the German-speaking community and the German community of Elkhorn, and there he stayed, and he managed the hotel for many years. In 1946, Leonard and Florence Peterson purchased that sprawling building and called it simply the hotel. And they were Patsy's parents, and she's the one that I interviewed. She's their daughter, and I was delighted to hear her story of growing up in that sprawling building. They lived on the main floor. There was at least one more apartment on that floor. There were several sleeping rooms overhead and also several apartments. It wasn't just an ordinary hotel. It was a hotel that sometimes people lived in for a few weeks, sometimes a few months, but it became known as the hotel. Patsy recalled that long, sprawling porch that surrounded the hotel. And she remembered fondly hearing the murmur of voices as the neighbors would gather on that porch in the evening while the house was cooling down. And over the murmur of those voices, you would hear the children down below on the street shrieking and playing and using up those last hours of daylight. I'd like to think that the windows were opened upstairs, letting in the evening breezes. They didn't have central air at that time. And I can just visualize those evenings. How long has it been since you've seen the neighbors out on the front porch visiting, waiting for the house to cool down? As I visited with Patsy, I recalled her saying, "My mother called this place a castle." She loved those extra rooms. There was always space for everything, extra closets. I had the opportunity to visit that sprawling building after it was cleaned out and ready for sale. And I could relate to her statement of, my mother thought this was a castle. My mother would have thought the same thing. We lived in a small house in the Sand Hills during those 30s, and when my grandfathers would come to visit, they were both single at that time, had lost their mates, and when they would come to visit, well, we kids had to give up our bedrooms, and we slept on the floor. We didn't have extra rooms. We didn't have an extra closet. In fact, our closet was an extra long nail on the back of the bedroom door. My mother would have thought this was a castle too. Patsy told of going into the attic and exploring. People didn't throw away what they weren't using. They stored it in the attic. And she told of finding pitchers and wash basins, old trunks full of memorabilia, full of ledgers and receipts, a whole trunk full of history in the attic. And those beds that you may have seen on this picture were still there. There were still items in the attic. But what did Patsy say about living in that sprawling hotel? She said, "I had a happy childhood." That structure sold just a few months ago. There was big decisions to be made as to whether it would be torn down or whether it would be usable, but it was sold. And the new owners, Brian and Megan Michaels, tell us that they're looking forward to extending their roots in Elkhorn and reconditioning the old hotel into a modern Airbnb. They hope to bring the hotel back to its original classical form for locals and travelers who can journey back to the turn of the century. I'm excited, and I hope I live long enough to see that happen. Well, let's go back to the Victorian house on 4025 Izzard. The house and the contents sold in the last of September and early October of 2022, barely a few months ago. The closing was November 4th of 2022. A new family now occupies this piece of Omaha history. New hands will turn the ornate doorknobs. The same hinges will open those magnificent wooden doors. There's an ornate water heater in the basement. It'll probably stay there. Maybe they couldn't get it out. But if you can imagine a hot water heater at the time that that house was built, when my family, who were living in a sod house, were going to an open well to draw their water for every purpose, that house at 4025 Izzard had a hot water heater. It's a beautiful thing. As Kyle removed the for sale sign from the front of this magnificent Victorian home, he penned these words: "Today I say goodbye to you, one of the most amazing homes I've ever had the opportunity to list. I spent hours researching your history, and the more I read, the more I was intrigued. I'm grateful for the new owners that will appreciate you as much as Lauren and her parents did. Thank you, 40 25. What were Lauren's words as she left the home? You may have read her article in the Omaha World Herald just a few months ago. She said, I had a happy childhood. What did Patsy say? I had fun living in that rambling house. What did my dad say? He said, I remember the red geraniums. I remember the yellow canaries. And I remember the happy, noisy family that I grew up with, even on the prairies of Nebraska. And I'm not sure what my kids will say, but I hope they had happy memories of those first 20 years when we lived in that little house. We built that new one in 1969, and that's over 50 years ago, and I still refer to it as the new house on the farm. But it doesn't carry the memories that that first little house did. One of my favorite singers way back in the 40s was Eddie Arnold. Some of you may remember, he was a good country singer. He made this little song famous in 1949. They say a man's home is his castle. He's like a king on the throne. It may be a shack down on the railroad track, but everything in it's his home.